Our story today is found in John chapter 2, verses 1 to 11, the master Vintner, which is a winemaker. The lamps had been lit. Platters of olives, roasted lamb, stuffed grape leaves, and dates stood at the ready next to row after row of amphora filled with wine. The guests chatted among themselves in quiet but joyful tones when at last someone hushed them. They were coming. Moments later, the groom entered the gate, wearing a white linen robe trimmed in blue. A ceremonial crown rested on his head. His new bride, still veiled, accompanied him. She, too, was enrobed in her finest. Gold bangles jingled on her wrists, and she was beautifully adorned for her groom. The groom extended his hand to the bride and led her into the house. As a reverent hush fell over family and friends, he spread a corner of his cloak over her shoulders, symbolizing his commitment to protect and care for her before proclaiming for all to hear, "This is my wife, and I am her husband for all eternity." He took her by the hand, and the lovers were excused to be alone as their wedding celebration began. Eventually, of course, the happy couple rejoined the party as the rightful king and queen. But there was no rush. The event would last a full 7 days. Jesus and his family and some of his disciples were among the happily taking part in the feast. Now, the feast was a tremendous social responsibility. The couple's families were expected to provide generously for a proper celebration. For days, all went well. Delicious food was plentiful, wine flowed, but when the unthinkable happened, 2 of the servants bustled into the side room where wine amphoras lined the wall. They walked to the nearest one, grasped the handles, and prepared to strain against the weight, only to find it far too light. It was empty. Frowning, the men turned to the next amphora and found only dregs at the bottom. They walked along the line of containers and rapped on each one with their knuckles. Again and again, a hollow echo rang throughout the room. Their eyes widened in alarm, and they rushed out from the room to deliver the news. They were out of wine. The disaster had to be brought to the attention of the groom's mother immediately, and when it was, her joyful instantly turned to horror, and tears filled her eyes, and she began to wring her hands. Seeing her distress, Mary asked quietly as to the nature of the dilemma. She listened and patted the woman's arm and asked her to wait. She knew someone who might be able to help. As she turned to leave, she motioned for the servants to follow her and then scanned the faces of those that lined along the triclinian table in the main room. But he was not there. Then she made her way into the courtyard and found him enjoying the party with his friends. She approached her son, cleared her throat, and leaned in close to his ear. "They are out of wine," she said. Jesus turned to look at her for a moment, and then quietly replied, "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour is not yet come." Mary simply turned to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Jesus looked around the courtyard, and his eyes fell on 6 limestone water jars kept for ceremonial washing. Each could hold 20 or 30 gallons of water. Costly limestone jars, the back-breaking labor required to fill them, all to be poured out in homage to the traditions of the fathers that had nothing to do with God's heart. Yet the Pharisees were so concerned about breaking one of God's laws that they had established fences and hedges around each law. The idea was to place enough traditions around each law so that the law itself would never be broken. But what began as a noble desire for holiness eventually took on a life of its own as neighbor began judging neighbor on how well they kept the traditions. And over time, the inevitable happened. The Pharisees fell into the trap of legalism. They would define the sin, judge it at will, and lay the whole burden on their fellow man. This practice had reached the point that not even a wedding celebration was spared from the crushing yoke of tradition. Jesus turned to the servants and motioned to the jars. "Fill the jars with water." The servants quickly began doing what they were told, and when the last purification jar was filled to the brim, the servants returned for further instructions. Now, he told them, draw some out and take to the master of the banquet. Well, one of the servants grasped a large pot by the handle and thrust it beneath the surface of the water into the purification jar. When he raised it again, the water that ran from the lips of the pot and down the handle was dark, and sweet aroma of wine wafted through the air. The servant's eyes widened as he called for the serving pitcher and carefully filled it. Now the master of the banquet was a corpulent man, full beard cascaded in waves over his rich robes. He was engaged in a lively conversation with the diminutive older man next to him, but he would occasionally pick up his empty goblet and glance disapprovingly into the dregs at the bottom. As soon as the servant arrived at his side and filled the goblet, the man reached for it without looking at it, without interrupting his conversation, and took a sip. The servant watched breathlessly from the back of the room. His eyes widened, and although the man next to him chattered on, it was the goblet that now had the banquet master's full attention. As he swirled the wine in the cup beneath the lamplight, he observed the depth of color. He lifted it to his nose and breathed in the scent of vanilla and clove. He closed his eyes, took another sip, and savored hints of berries, cherries, and plums. He set the goblet on the table and called the groom to his side and laughed and gave him a joyous slap on the back. Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. Merciful Savior, forgive me for sacrificing joy and stealing it from others because I'm too proud to receive your gifts humbly. I've been guilty of building fences around my own idea of holiness for myself and others because I want control more than I want to trust. Please show me where I have set myself up as God, honoring tradition more than your heart. Most of all, forgive me for misrepresenting you as stingy and condemning, when in truth you are the giver of every good and perfect gift. You, my Jesus, are the master Vintner, and I joyfully worship you. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again.